One of the most important elements to making your paper clear is context. Before you know if you're providing enough context, you need to know what context is. Whenever you're writing, you have your topic. And the context is the information surrounding that topic, the background knowledge, basically anything that would help an unfamiliar reader understand the topic more fully, like when it happened, or where it happened, or what was going on as it happened. So it depends a lot on the topic what kind of context you need to give, but no matter what the topic is, you need to think about your reader. It can be a little weird to think about if you're turning your assignment into a teacher you know well. You might know that the teacher already read the story you're writing about because you read it in class together. Or if you're a homeschooler, maybe you're turning your story about your first vacation into your parent who was with you on the trip, so you know they know all about it. But most assignments aren't written with the person assigning it in mind. It's not written for your parent or for your teacher. It's written for an unfamiliar reader, someone who doesn't know you or who hasn't read the book or who hasn't researched the topic. And it's your job to provide the context to help them understand what you're talking about. You have to imagine your work being read by this unfamiliar reader to make sure you give them context. Let's look at an example. When you're writing a personal essay about your own experiences, the context is usually going to be details about your own life. So let's say that you are writing about your first vacation, as we just mentioned before. Maybe this is a sentence from my rough draft of my paper about my first vacation. I said, I stayed in the beach house and shared a room with Sally. Because it was so hot in the room, we walked to the beach every morning and stayed there all day. This information would probably make sense to someone who knew me or who was on the vacation with me, but it's going to be confusing to an unfamiliar reader. How old was I? Who's Sally? Why was it so hot? So let's say that I'm going to make some additions to this. I'm going to add some context. When I was 10, I stayed in a New Jersey beach house. I shared a room with my older cousin Sally, who was 12. It was an attic room, and the AC didn't really reach up there. Because it was so hot in the room, we walked to the beach every morning and stayed there all day. So here I've given you, the unfamiliar reader who did not know me, context about my age, about where I was, about who Sally was to me, how old Sally was, why it was so hot in the room. So I've given you the context you need to understand my story. And so I would want to go through and add that context anywhere that it's missing, anywhere that details would help the reader understand what's going on. So that's how it works when you're giving personal context, but what about when you're writing an informative essay that required some research or reading? Let's say that I'm writing about honeybees using Jay Hassler's book, The Way of the Hive, which is a book all about honeybees. So here's a sentence from my rough draft explaining something that happens in the first few pages of the book. I said, Nayuki begs Devora not to stuff her into the hole. To get Nayuki to calm down, Devora tells the story of how Nayuki came to be. Do you understand that? Chances are, unless you've read that book really recently and remember it really well, you have no idea what I'm talking about. So I'm going to need to add some context here for you, my unfamiliar reader, so that this makes sense. And it might look something like this. The Way of the Hive is a graphic novel that explains how honeybees live. Early in the book, Nayuki, the main character who goes through the whole bee life cycle, begs her big sister Devora not to stuff her into the hole of the hive where she'll go through metamorphosis. To get Nayuki to calm down, Devora tells the story of how Nayuki came to be, starting as an egg laid by the queen that turned into a tiny larva. So now I've provided the context that helps you, as someone who has not read this book before, understand what I'm talking about. And I would want to make sure that my whole paper has that kind of context to really connect with an audience member who doesn't know as much about the book as I do, because I've read it recently and I'm sort of the expert on it in this particular situation where I'm bringing it forward in my writing. Notice also that in both of my examples, the paper got a lot longer once I started to add context. So sometimes if your paper is really short, it's a sign that it needs some more context, that you have written it without that unfamiliar audience in mind. So, my biggest piece of advice, the big takeaway for this is anytime that you are writing, you want to take a moment and think about what would somebody who doesn't know about this topic need to know in order for it to make sense for them. So you want to think like your unfamiliar audience and make sure that you have provided the information that will help them understand your writing.